Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire supported by Glenlivet Books. The recently released Q2 results of the GDP and the economy have been widely interpreted as a sign that the economy has decisively turned a corner. But is that the full and complete picture? Or if you dig a little deeper, might a significantly different impression emerge? That's the key issue I shall discuss today with the country director of the International Growth Centre, India's former chief statistician, and one of the country's foremost economists, Pranab Sen. Professor Sen, let me start with what I call the good news aspects of the Q2 results before I come to points of concern. To begin with, in Q2, GDP has grown by 8.4%, which is appreciably more than the RBI estimate of 7.9%. And I also noticed that in absolute figures, 35.73 lakh crore is just a fraction more than the pre-pandemic levels of 2 years ago. How much comfort can the government take from this?
Well, is it a question of whether the government takes comfort or we take comfort? These are encouraging figures, and we really shouldn't underplay the importance of at least having gotten back to the pre-COVID level.
Even if it's by a fraction?
Even if it's by a fraction, because things were looking so bleak during the second wave that this is really quite remarkable. So if you recall, last year, you had the lockdown effect, and then you had the first wave effect, which followed the lockdown. And it took us a while to start coming back to anything resembling normality. We seem to have come back a lot quicker because the second wave was infinitely worse than the first.
So this is a creditable achievement for the economy?
Yes, indeed.
When you look at the different sectors that make up GDP, the one that strikes you first is agriculture. It's grown by 4.5% for a second consecutive year, which means that compared to pre-pandemic levels, it's 7.6% up. Would I be right in saying that agriculture has played a critical role in boosting GDP growth?
Agriculture has played an incredibly important role, and most so during the lockdown, because agriculture was the only sector that was allowed to do anything. So it's played an extremely important role. And there's something else you should note, Karan, because it's a plus and a minus, is that this footprint that we are talking about is right in the middle of the farmers' agitation. And there are thousands of farmers who have left their fields and come to hang around Delhi. Nevertheless, agriculture has grown. So that's a good sign in the sense that agriculture is resilient. It's a bad sign because what it's telling you is that there are too many people in agriculture, and even if a large chunk of them move out to do something else, it makes no appreciable difference to what agriculture does.
And this second point is an important one for the government and for statisticians and economists to note, because it underlines the need to bring people out of agriculture.
The bad news, Karan, even worse, is that that need has been known for a while. It's been known ever since the Green Revolution.
And ignored?
Happened. No. And if you look at the last 40 years' data on employment, sequentially employment in agriculture had been falling. If you look at the latest employment data, employment in agriculture has actually gone up, first time in 40 years.
But that's because migrant workers are going back and
Not
falling
just
back.
migrant workers. In fact, there's a very interesting number which came out just the other day, which is that there's something called urban agriculture, which is really the periphery of urban areas. Urban agriculture has seen an appreciable growth, which means people in urban areas have lost their jobs, and since they are local residents, they've again gone back to the family farm.
But this is distress employment, not employment of choice.
This is distress employment. Now, this is where the problem really arises.
I'll come to employment in a moment's time, but let me carry on with what I call the good news points of the GDP results. A second is clearly to do with private investment. It's not only 11% more than last year, but it's almost 1.5% more than pre-pandemic levels. And the Indian Express points out that private investment in Q2 of this year is higher than in any other Q2 of the previous 5 years. Is this a sign that industrialists and businessmen are now pretty confident about the future as they see it?
Yes. Perhaps the more correct way of expressing it, Karan, would be to say that some Indian businessmen and corporates are a lot more confident.
That some is an important word.
The some and a lot.
So it's a fraction or a minority that are very confident, but they are very confident in a very big way.
Yes.
When you look at the quarter 2 results of this year, side by side with quarter 2 of 2 years ago, you notice that this year, it's 5 sectors that have actually pushed growth. But 2 of the biggest sectors, construction and trade, hotels, transport and broadcast services, which I believe together constitute 23% of GDP, these 2 big sectors are still below pre-pandemic levels. So although we have growth, it's by no means broad-based growth.
No. So essentially, the sectors which are sort of person intensive, which is both these sectors, trade, tourism and restaurants and construction, they still are lagging behind. And there are various reasons for it, I suppose.
But they also constitute 23% of GDP.
But much of that also has to do with restrictions that have been placed. So if you think about restaurants, for instance, in most places there's a restriction that you cannot have more than 50% of your registered capacity.
Which is a curb on the work they can do. But the point I'm making is that when we are pleased by the fact that the economy's just gone above pre-pandemic levels, you have to bear in mind that 2 of the major sectors of the economy, constituting 23%, are still significantly below pre-pandemic levels.
This is correct.
Which is why I say it's growth, but it's not broad-based growth.
Yeah, it is. That's correct. Now, the thing, of course, is if there are legal restrictions to growth, right, it does not inherently reflect on the economy per se.
Absolutely. It's to do with the government putting restrictions. But either way, we haven't got broad-based growth, whether it's to do with the economy or whether it's to do with government restrictions.
Sure.
Let's then at this moment come to what I call points of concern. And I suppose the first is private consumption, which constitutes between 55 and 56% of GDP. It's still 3.5% below pre-pandemic levels. And in a sense, this is corroborated by a series of consumer sentiment surveys which showed that consumer sentiment is somewhere between 25 and 30% below pre-pandemic levels. How much of a concern is this gap in private consumption?
It is a major concern. You know, there are 2 factors that play out here. One factor is we do know that last year households experienced a loss of 12 lakh crores. All right? That's bound to affect consumption. And it would play out during the course of this year. The second factor is that if employment-intensive sectors, like you said, construction and trade, hotels and restaurants, if they are not growing, then employment isn't growing and therefore household incomes aren't growing.
Which is a double whammy.
Which is a double whammy. So it is a concern. And much will depend on how quickly this returns to normality.
I'll point out, although I'll discuss it in greater detail later, that this is a concern the government hasn't noted. And the chief economic advisor, in his statement, actually almost ignored this. Let's come to a second point of concern. And this time I'm talking about government expenditure, which, as you know, constitutes 11% of GDP. But at a time like this, most people would say it's critical. And yet, to my astonishment, I discovered that government expenditure in quarter 2 was almost 17% below what it was in pre-pandemic levels. I mean, how do you make sense of that?
Well, there's a correction to be made, Karan. What is down is government consumption expenditure. What is not getting reflected there is public investments. And from all indications, public investments are up. But there's a second point which people don't seem to have noticed.
Can you, before we go to the second point, explain the distinction between government consumption being down but public expenditure being up?
Not public expenditure, public investment.
Public investment. What is the distinction so that layman can understand?
Yeah, the government consumption is when the government is actually buying goods and services for its current use. Public investment is in creating infrastructure,
roads, railways,
so on and so forth, ports, airports, whatever. It's creating the infrastructure for the future.
So how much of
Investments
a problem,
are certainly up.
how much of a problem is that government consumption is down, though public investment is up?
Well, it's a distributional thing. So government consumption means that particular sort of sectors, their demand has fallen because the government consumption is down. But other sectors, particularly the construction sector, will be benefiting hugely from the additional investment the government is making.
So the fact that government expenditure is 17% below pre-pandemic levels is not such a major problem in your eyes, since public investment is actually up. It's government consumption that's down.
That's down.
So to point this out as a point of concern is perhaps mistaken.
Well, there's a further complication, Karan, which you, I think, should know, and most people haven't noticed this, by the way. It is that in the national accounts, they report two figures. One figure is the GDP, which is gross domestic product, and the other is the GVA, which is gross value added. Gross value added is the value of what is being produced in the country. GDP is a more inclusive measure. The difference between these two numbers is what's called net indirect taxes, which is total indirect taxes minus total subsidies. The interesting thing that has happened in this particular GDP footprint, and this is unlike what was happening earlier to this, is that the net indirect taxes have been negative. Now, the reason it is interesting is that precisely over this period, what we had seen was a sharp increase in GST collections, which is a part of the tax component, which implies that subsidies have gone up more than tax collections have. Right? That's not showing up. You know, normally one would have expected the government to have tom-tommed this, really gone to town with it, saying,
Because we are proud of the subsidy
that we are putting in and helping consumption along.
So what does the government silence mean?
I don't know. It could mean that much of the subsidy is going from the states, because you know,
and not the central
the
government.
accounts. Yeah, the accounts don't distinguish between center and states. So it could be the states who are putting in the subsidies, and therefore the center can't claim credit, or it's inexplicable.
So this is a point which is mystifying because we can't understand it, rather a point that is one of concern to do with GDP growth.
No, it's a good thing that they've increased subsidies, because
But we don't know who takes the credit.
Yes, and the center hasn't been taking the credit, which is what is mystifying.
Which suggests that probably the states have done it, which is why the center is quiet about it. It doesn't want to give credit to the states. Many state governments are opposition governments as far as the center is concerned. It's a very interesting point you point out. But I'll just mark for the audience that it's a mystifying point rather than a point of, but not a point of concern.
No, it's a point of, actually, it's a positive point.
It's a positive point. Let's then come to what has happened to MSMEs, which are 30% of GDP and perhaps 80 to 85% of employment. Because Q2 results don't immediately tell you, but when you dig deeper, you can begin to understand. Now, a lot of MSMEs are involved in the tourist, communication services, hotels and trade sector. But this sector is almost 10% below pre-pandemic levels. So if the sector as a whole is below pre-pandemic levels, doesn't that suggest that MSMEs are suffering? They're struggling.
MSMEs have been struggling now for a while, since the lockdown. I mean, the blow really fell on the MSME sharply during the lockdown, and it has continued since then. So to know what's happening to MSMEs, just looking at the GDP figures isn't enough. You need to look for corroborative evidence as to what's going on. The clearest sign is what's happening to bank lending, because MSMEs, unlike corporates, do not have access to the capital markets. So practically the entire financing, whether for working capital or for expansion, comes from the banking sector. The banking sector data suggests that there has been very little flow into MSMEs. The latest numbers that the RBI put out for last month suggests an uptick. But that is something we need to take with a pinch of salt, because it's an 8.5% growth in lending, is because your wholesale price index, which represents the costs of production in the MSME, has gone up by 12%. So the growth in credit doesn't even meet the increase in costs.
Absolutely. So what you're saying, and this is something that the quarter two results up front don't tell you, it's only when you dig deeper and when you also look at bank lending, which is not covered by quarter two results, that you discover that the position of MSMEs who've been struggling is that they continue to struggle.
They continue to struggle.
And since this is 30% of GDP, it's bad news for the country.
Yes.
But this is not immediately covered by the Q2 results. You have to dig deeper to discover this.
Well, the thing is, it will eventually appear in the results, but not in the same quarter.
Absolutely.
It will come with a lag.
So when people look at the Q2 results as they did for the last 2 days and say this is unalloyed good news, the economy's turned a corner, one of the things we should say is, no, hang on, look at MSMEs, 30% of GDP, 80% of employment, they are struggling and their position hasn't improved.
Yes, from all indications, they haven't improved and may well be getting worse.
Let's look at the Q2 figures in terms of employment and jobs, which is what matters to lay people. Once again, you have to tease the results to understand what's happened, because the results don't tell you upfront. But a lot of jobs are created by two sectors in particular: construction and trade, hotels, tourism, and other allied services. But again, those are under pre-pandemic levels. And in the case of trade and hotels, very significantly under pre-pandemic levels. So does that mean that there is a squeeze on employment opportunities and possibly pressure on income levels?
No, there is. I mean, in fact, I think we started out with that practically, saying that pressure is there, and that was showing up in the consumption numbers, which haven't really gotten back.
And showing up in the fact that agricultural employment is going up because people are having to give up jobs in cities and go back to their land.
That's exactly correct. So just the headline unemployment numbers don't tell you the story. Because what's happened is that people who are in the lower income brackets, they cannot afford to remain idle. So they'll take up whatever job and be shown as employed.
But it's a worse job with less money.
With less money.
Or they've gone back to their farms.
And therefore less multiplier effects on the economic growth.
So either they've taken up less remunerative jobs with less multiplier effect on demand and growth, or they've lost their jobs and they've gone back to whatever family land they had and added, in a sense, to rural employment, or if you look at it differently, rural underemployment.
Underemployment has become worse.
Again, this is a side of the truth of the economy the quarter two results don't immediately reflect. You have to dig deeper to find out. On their own, it doesn't tell you anything about employment.
No, about employment it doesn't. They're not even designed to. You have to draw inferences. But the point is, you can't say that. What it does do is to give you a partial story.
Particularly when you look at trade, hotels and things.
No, the whole GDP numbers. What it is telling you is corporate India is doing well, thank you. That's what it's telling.
And MSME India continues to suffer.
Continues to suffer.
And the unorganized sector, therefore, continues to suffer.
That's right.
And 80% of people employed in the unorganized sector are either losing jobs or doing jobs that are less remunerative.
Yes. And that's showing up, as I said, you have to look for corroborative numbers. Just focusing on the GDP numbers won't give it to you. So look at what's happening to wages. Wages are down, not up, despite the fact that the consumer price inflation has been upwards of 5% for a long time now.
And despite the fact that corporates seem to be gung-ho, or at least
corporates are gung-ho, and by the way, corporate salaries are going up.
In a sense, this also indicates a polarity of what's happening to people in the Indian economy. The 80% in the unorganized sector are losing jobs, they are worse off, their salaries are down, and therefore their impact on demand will be minimal. But the minority in the corporate sector are doing extremely well. And within that, you're saying a further minority is actually pretty gung-ho.
Yes.
So India is becoming two countries.
Well, in a sense, it always has been.
But it's more so.
It's becoming more so. It's become more so. We were converging up to a point.
That convergence is now diverging.
Now it's diverging.
Let's at this point come to something that the Q2 results don't cover at all. And to be honest, they're not intended to, but that's the question of rural employment or unemployment. Now, we know from the fact that the government has announced that they need to raise 50,000 crore more for NREGA. Doesn't that suggest that NREGA demand this year is pretty close to NREGA demand last year, which was the worst of the pandemic, and therefore rural unemployment or underemployment remains a serious concern?
Yes, it does. I mean, I don't think there is any question about it. The NREGA is not a bad bellwether for what is happening to the rural employment and even more so rural incomes. It's really rural incomes what you're talking about, and particularly for landless labor. So it's a very important indicator, and the NREGA figures may actually be understating the problem. And the reason for that is that the NREGA figures reflect only those which have been registered as asking for employment. And we know from anecdotal evidence that there are lots of places where once the state government machinery which is supposed to deliver NREGA either runs out of money or runs out of support of various kinds.
And we know that already NREGA payments are several weeks or months behind time.
That's right. So they just stopped registering people. So that the unregistered work seekers are simply not being reported.
So there's a sizable proportion of people in rural India who need jobs,
Yes,
are going to NREGA, but they're not being registered because NREGA doesn't have the funds. So they're not covered at all.
yeah.
And just to make a little point about NREGA itself, if I've got my facts right in my memory, the amount allocated in the budget was roughly 70-odd thousand crore.
This is right.
If she needs 50,000 crore more, that will take it to a total of 1.2 lakh crore. And that's even more than last year's figure.
Well, you know, of the 70,000 crores that was allocated this year, nearly 40,000 crores went off paying last year's arrears.
Which is why she needs 50,000 more.
Why she needs 50,000 more.
And perhaps the same thing will happen next year.
Quite likely.
So NREGA is a great indication, and I'm sort of bringing this to a conclusion, it's a great indication of rural demand, rural underemployment or unemployment, but NREGA doesn't meet it fully because the figure when allocated is sizably to cover the year before's demand, and it still falls short of the present year.
Yes. And just to add one more point, in a good agricultural year,
Which is
supposing God hadn't smiled on us and given us monsoons this time around, it would have been infinitely worse.
So in other words, the rural underemployment, unemployment situation is somewhat ameliorated by God's mercy, not by the government's good work.
Yes, unfortunately so.
Let's at this point, because we've looked at the details, pull out and try and see if we can find a big picture. To begin with, do you accept this is a V-shaped recovery as the government insists, or would the alphabet K be a better description?
Well, you see, the alphabet K is an explicit recognition of the duality that we were talking about. And what it is saying is that there is certainly V-shaped recovery in a part of the economy.
But it's a small part.
Well, it depends. In terms of its share of GDP, it's not that small.
33%.
No, the corporate sector is much larger than that. Corporate sector plus government is larger than that. It's nearly 55%. The rest of the economy is going down. So in terms of GDP, it looks like a V. But if you take it in terms of other parameters of development and well-being, there is a downside which is fairly.
This is very well put. In terms of GDP, because the corporate sector and the government sector together are 55%, it looks like a V. If more than 50% of GDP is doing well, it looks like a V. But if you look in terms of well-being, if you look in terms of the impact on people, if you look in terms of what matters, are the Indian people better off or are they without jobs and suffering? It's a decided K.
Yeah,
Because
on the average, the Indian people are still worse off.
in fact, given that 80% of Indian people are in the unorganized sector and MSMEs and they are struggling or worse off, for the majority of people,
Yes,
this is the bottom end of the K.
Yes.
For the corporate sector, it's the upper end.
That's exactly right.
And that, in a sense, takes me back to the point I made earlier. This is two Indias.
Yes. But as I said, we've always had two Indias for the longest time.
It's just that the divergence
It's
is getting
that
sharper.
earlier there was a convergence happening, now it's diverging.
What about another point made insistently by the chief economic advisor in interviews and again in an article he wrote today for the Economic Times? He insists that by the end of the financial year, 31st of March 2022, India will have grown in double digits. Do you accept that?
Compared to last year, it's possible.
But is
It's
that
not
the base
impossible.
effect or is that the economy?
That's the base effect.
So because we shrank
Because
so
you
much
shrank by
last year,
7.5% last year, double-digit growth this year isn't anything to write home about. You would be only about 2.5 percentage points higher than 1920.
so you're saying
So-
two very important things. One, if double-digit growth happens, I'm putting in the word if on purpose, it's almost predominantly because of the base effect of last year. We shrank so much, we have to grow in comparison. Secondly, if we do achieve 10%, it's only 2% more than what we were a year ago,
Yeah, before
2
the
years
pandemic.
ago. And as you said, double-digit growth is nothing to write home about.
For this year. Double-digit growth is great,
But not
under
this
normal
year.
circumstances. This year, in fact, if we get double-digit growth, we should heave a sigh of relief,
If we get it.
if we get it.
And if we do get it, it's not something to tom-tom in such a big way.
Not really.
As you said, nothing to write home
Right,
about.
nothing.
Let's look down the road. If private consumption doesn't pick up substantially, and if government expenditure remains as it is, will that have an adverse impact on private investment? And secondly, will that in turn affect growth?
Well, yeah, no, the dynamics of this are complex. Till consumption demand picks up, investments will remain subdued. Now, you may well ask, but investments have done well as per the GDP numbers. But as I said, that's investment of a particular variety by a particular segment.
And a minority, as you said.
And a minority, and it's also a segment which happens to be very capital intensive. So it's a type of capacity creation which is not going to be generating jobs for you in
And
the
they
future.
won't be creating demand.
Now, this is where the whole problem. Yes, certain demand will be created. You and I will have more earnings. So it's the upper 20% that you're talking about.
But
will
the
have more
bottom 80
earnings.
won't.
The bottom 80 will not. And what's going to happen is, and this is we saw earlier after demonetization, that you and I start reaching our consumption saturation points at some time. It took a year last time around. Maybe it'll take a year and a half this time around. But once you reach the saturation point, what happens is that our income then spills over into essentially imports. We travel more, we go out, we spend money on things we can't get here because we have saturated ourselves with what is available.
That doesn't help the Indian economy.
That doesn't help the Indian economy one bit. To an extent, that may have already started, because if you look at the import figures, they are going through the roof. So, we are crowing about exports, but the fact of the matter is your trade deficit is increasing day by day.
So what you're saying is a very important point. Private investment may look good on paper, but it's only a particular type of investment, only done by a particular minority of corporates. It's capital intensive, it doesn't create too many jobs. That's not going to impact on demand in a sizable way. It may impact on yours and mine. But on the 80% who are not involved, 80% of the population who are not involved, who are in the unorganized sector, their demand will remain flat. And therefore, there will come a time when private investment will actually stop growing because the demand that should sustain it will be missing.
Yes. So basically the process by which people move up the economic ladder, if that gets disrupted, at some point demand plateaus and then may even decline.
So what you're saying is that if we don't find ways of boosting private consumption, if we don't find ways of boosting it, whatever uptake we've seen in private investment will soon start to flatten out.
Flatten out.
Give it a year and a half, but it'll flatten out. That means the key for the government is boost private consumption. You must get
At
back.
the bottom of the pyramid.
The second concern is inflation. I know that the CPI is only 4.5, but as you pointed out, WPI is at a very worrying 12.5, and I presume it won't be long before CPI starts to rise as well. When that happens, won't that again suppress private consumption because things are more expensive and people don't buy? And in turn, it might encourage the RBI to kick up interest rates, and that in turn will suppress growth.
The RBI, given its mandate in a situation of the type you're describing, will have to increase interest rates. They are mandated.
It's a matter of time.
It's just a matter of time and judgment.
And that will suppress growth.
Yes, it will.
And if inflation doesn't come down quickly, it would also suppress private consumption. So that's another reason why, as you look down the road, there are question marks.
But the big question mark there, Karan, which is a question again nobody seems to be asking, is why is there inflation? You know, if you think of the discourse that's happening, is that capacity utilization in India is still low.
It's about 70%.
It's about 68, 70%. If that were the case, why is there inflation? Now, unless you, and until you have a compelling sort of reason for it,
You can't tackle it.
you can't tackle it, number one. And let me tell you, the problem may actually be that pricing power has shifted to a smaller number of players. And they are actually determining prices. So the level of competition in India may have declined, and the pricing power has shifted from consumers to a smaller group of producers.
Is that a reflection of the fact that the majority of consumers actually are not spending because they don't have the money?
Well, no, it's a reflection of the fact that the MSME sector is in doldrums.
Absolutely.
And they are not being able to provide the competition that they used to.
So here we have an interesting problem. We know that continuing and rising inflation will affect growth, it will affect private consumption, but we don't know what to do about it because we aren't absolutely sure why we have inflation in the first place.
That's right. In a situation of low capacity utilization.
And on top of that, there is perhaps, I put it in quotations, the imminent problem that America will soon have to start raising its interest rates because it has almost unprecedented inflation of 6.2.
Over 6%, yeah.
When that happens, that will again have an impact on the Indian economy because money that's here will be dragged out.
Yes.
So we have two worrying concerns as we look down the road. One, private consumption, which needs to be boosted, but the government is not doing too much about it. It's almost unconcerned. And secondly, this inflation, which we don't understand and which could be exacerbated by what happens in America.
Yes, and how that game is going to play out isn't very clear. But I think President Biden is getting very concerned about inflation. 6.2 is...
He talks about it increasingly now.
No, and he should. So I suspect what's going to be happening is that they will withdraw the monetary impulse. He's already got this large expenditure package out. So he's going to shift from a monetary expansion to a more fiscal expansion to support the economy. So what will then happen is the level of liquidity in the global economy will go down.
A lot of money will go out of India.
A lot of money will go out of India. Which may in itself not be a bad thing.
It may affect inflation. It may bring inflation down.
Right.
But it also means that a lot of funds that are available because they're leaving will force the RBI to push up interest rates a bit more.
It may not, because RBI may not need to, because interest rates would go up by themselves.
So what happens in America, interest rates will go up by themselves, RBI may not have to.
Yeah.
In other words, banks themselves will put it up.
That's right.
So you'll have a double problem in India.
Well, whether you call it a double problem or not, the RBI is playing around with the interest rate is essentially to try and signal to the bank what they should do.
But if banks are doing it itself.
They're doing it anyway.
Finally, there is the threat of Omicron hanging in the air, a spectre that we don't quite know what to do about, but there is the fear that if it tilts in the wrong direction, it will clearly impact the internal economy. But I put it to you that it will also impact demand for exports. And because if Omicron affects Western economies, demand for our exports will come down, and that will affect the fact that exports are 23% of GDP, and in the last 2 years they've grown by 17%. If exports decline, again the momentum for growth in the long term will also come down.
Yes, but the issue there is again an issue of sequencing. Where would the Omicron effect come first? If it comes in the countries to whom we export, then what you're saying is absolutely right. But if it happens to come to countries who are our competitors, our exports may actually gain because there will be a supply side effect that would be playing out.
So, as far as textiles are concerned, we have
Textiles
to pray it
also.
happens in Vietnam and Bangladesh.
Bangladesh and not to us.
But if it happens in Bangladesh, it's going to happen to us
It's
too.
going to happen to us, but that's a separate issue. We assume that it's going to spread, but the
But where is
sequence
the-
and where?
That's a very interesting point you make. But let me put it like this. At the moment, Western economies are fairly paranoid about the Omicron effect.
Yes.
And I imagine that as they start declaring lockdowns or restrictions and take other measures, their economic activity will slide down. And if that happens, their demand will slide down, and that will affect our exports.
No, not necessarily. You know, again, the experience from the past has been that when shutdowns have happened, local production has stopped.
And so exports grow.
Exports actually
So, in
grow.
a sense, we have to hope they shut down in the West.
Yes, in your importing countries.
Okay. So, the Omicron effect is a spectre, but we're not sure quite what its impact will be on our exports.
Not yet.
If it happens to us, however, there will be an
That-
impact on the internal economy.
No, and your exports, because it may affect your production for all you know.
So, we have to hope and pray that Omicron happens to the West, and we have to hope and pray
Well, let's
it
not
hap-
hope it happens to anybody,
But
but
it happens
supposing
to
it
our
does
neighbors,
happen.
but not to us.
Yes.
Okay, we're coming right to the end of the interview. Let me put to you what I think is the conclusion of the Business Standard leader yesterday when they were commenting on Tuesday's results. It is clear that India is far from out of the woods as yet, as far as the pandemic macroeconomic shock is concerned. Everything you said seems to agree with it, but I want to ask you, do you agree?
No. I would say India is out of the woods. Bharat is not.
Okay, we're back to the two-country analogy.
I'm back to the two-country analogy.
But that is very interesting. India is a minority of the country. Bharat is the 70-80% majority. 80% of the people of India are in the woods. And as far as they're concerned, and I'll misquote Robert Frost, they're terribly dark and they're horribly deep. For 20%, the sun is shining.
Yes.
That's a very interesting commentary on our country. One last thing. In these circumstances, if the Prime Minister were to pick up the phone and ring you this evening and say, Pranab, what the hell do I do? What would you tell him?
It frankly is very difficult to say because direct instruments to address the MSME sector really don't exist. There are all kinds of indirect instruments. The government, I think, is aware of the problem. The finance minister has repeatedly come on exhorting the banks to lend to the MSMEs. The banks have simply dug in the heels and said no. And for good reason. If I were a banker, I would do the same thing.
We don't
as
want
well.
to lose money.
We don't want to lose money, and so we are not going to do it.
So if the banks won't lend, how can she get money to the MSMEs?
The only side that the government can effectively address is, if you again think back what happened towards the end of the lockdown last year, which is to create special windows only for MSMEs that the banks have to provide for.
Did it
Remember
work
there
last
were
year?
Well, up to a point it did. So I think it was 3 lakh crores were provided, and I think they've dispersed some 2.1 lakh crores, which is still not.
It's only
small.
roughly 66%.
Yeah, but it's still a fairly tidy sum.
So
But you leave the bankers to themselves so that it becomes a part of their regular judgment call. They're not going to do it. I wouldn't do it.
you have to create a special window.
And say, this is only for them.
But you're well aware that when you last created the special window, only 66% did
That's
it
right.
work. But in the circumstances where there's nothing else you can do, 66% working is better than
Better
zero.
than nothing.
What about direct money transfer?
Well, you see, the whole thing really revolves around continuity. If you're talking about businesses coming back into production, they would want to see a certain continuity in the income stream that is supporting their consumption.
In other words, it has to continue for several months.
Years. I am not going to invest unless I see that demand maintaining itself till I have at least broken even.
So direct income transfers, if they're going to work, has to be
Has
with
to
an
announce
assurance
for-
that they will continue for years.
And it can't be from 3 months to 3 months. That doesn't help.
It has to be announced upfront, this
For
will
3
continue.
years.
And that sounds very unlikely to my ears, because it hasn't happened before, it's not going to happen again. So what you're saying to me is that once we've got over the benefit of the base effect, and which will boost us with luck to 10% this year, thereafter, if we can't find effective ways of boosting private consumption, which means basically boosting MSMEs, and we don't have a good way of doing it, then we've got a problem on the horizon for several years thereafter.
Yes, but what can be continued currently? I mean, you're absolutely right. Direct income transfers perhaps cannot. You can't even announce them long term. But the government investment programs can. And we need to announce upfront that over the next so many years, this is how much we are going to put into investment, because that's going to create a durable demand
Why
for
can't
the
the
MSME
government do
sector.
that? Why can't they announce
They,
upfront?
they can, provided that the center and the states are on the same page. It has to be a cooperative effort.
And
Because
that
the
is
kind
another
of
problem,
investments
the
I'm talking about is really in the domain of the states.
So the political dissonance, and that's a euphemism, between the centre and the states is another stumbling block in announcing the one measure they can announce,
They can actually
upfront announcement
and
of
would be
public
effective.
investment.
And would be effective.
So we end up right at the end with a sort of conclusion. We don't have good economic instruments to tackle the problem of MSMEs and private consumption. The instruments we have are not just not the greatest, but they're also hobbled by politics between the centre and the states.
Yes, I mean, all instruments are hobbled by politics.
Well, all I can say at the end of this interview, and I'll name all the gods I can think of, Jesus, Ram, Allah, Yahweh, Moses, please, all of us, help us. We need the help. You really mean it. I meant it jocularly, but you're agreeing. We need God's help.
We need help. So far, he has helped out. I mean, other than giving us COVID, of course, and that's his
But we need better help from God.
Yeah.
Thank you very much indeed, Professor Sen. Take care,
You're
stay
welcome.
safe, and keep away from Greek alphabets.
Yes, I know. We forced it, by the way.
Thank you very much indeed.
No?